the idea of some sort of afterlife, of survival after death, is in the core, perhaps is the core hope of most religious and spiritual traditions. So this is what we will discuss here, what we will talk about during this talk. We already know, it's very clear nowadays, that religion and spirituality has a wide variety of strong impacts on mental health. It's usually related to better levels, to lower levels of general mortality, depression, suicidal behavior, substance use and abuse, and higher levels of quality of life, well-being, and human flourishing. Of course, there is also the dark side. There are some negative impacts, especially related to negative religious coping and extrinsic religiosity. So there is no doubt anymore that most of the world's population have some sort of religion and spirituality, that religion and spirituality impacts human life. Two of the major challenges nowadays is first to understand how spirituality impacts health. The second is how can we translate this knowledge to clinical practice. In addition, there is a third very important aspect that still needs much more attention, understanding of the nature of the spiritual experiences. This is a bit of we will talk here. And based on all this evidence, our section approved a position statement on spirituality at WPA, the World Psychiatric Association. And this position statement has been translated to several different languages, and all of these versions are available at the section's website at the bottom of the slide here. And there are several definitions of spirituality and of religion, but one of the most agreed definitions is that spirituality is some sort of contact of relationship with a transcendent realm of reality. And this transcendental reality is usually considered sacred, the ultimate truth. And religion is the institutional or communal aspect of spirituality, a community that shares, belief, experience, and practice around the transcendent and the sacred. Okay. And the idea of some sort of belief in the survival of the soul, survival of consciousness, or whatever, survival of some part of us, is one of the core ideas of most religions and spiritual traditions around the globe, and even most of philosophies. So it's closely related to the concept of spirituality, that there is some sort of transcendent reality in ourselves and in the universe. And it is one of the most pervasive beliefs throughout cultures and religions, and also throughout philosophical traditions. Here, just some examples from the Western philosophical traditions, but of course, in the East also is quite similar. And even nowadays, despite some people believing that afterlife beliefs are not fashionable nowadays, actually, excluding China and Russia, at least 60% of the population of the 10 most populous countries in the world believe in life after death. Even in Western Europe, only 40% of Europeans accept that when people die, that is the end. There is no life after death. Okay, so this the disbelief in some sort of survival after death is not the most prevalent belief in any part of the world. And even there is some evidence that the higher level of education have been actually associated with the higher levels of acceptance that we have a soul and that there is survival after death. And these findings, for example, have been replicated in general population in France, Russia, and Brazil. The higher the educational level, the higher the prevalence of belief in some sort of afterlife. And this belief that is in the core of most spiritual traditions, that is widely disseminated around the world's population throughout history and even nowadays, it has major practical, existential, and ethical implications, several dimensions of life. It has a huge impact on worldview, meaning of life, and our understanding of the nature of the universe and of human beings. And also, it has a big impact on ethics and how we cope with grief. Just to give some examples, although this topic, the impact or the prevalence and the impact of believing some sort of afterlife, this is not a very common subject of research. There has been actually quite a number of studies investigating the connection between some sort of belief in the afterlife and mental health outcomes. Here we have some studies showing, for example, the higher levels of afterlife beliefs are usually related to lower levels of end-of-life despair, higher levels of anxiety. I'm sorry, it's in the opposite. Lower levels of anxiety and higher levels of tranquility. And it's also associated with a lower level of belief in a cynical world and higher levels of belief in an equitable world. And these two are related to lower psychiatric symptoms. It's also related to lower levels of acceptance of suicide and euthanasia, lower levels of psychiatric symptoms. It buffers the effect of financial hardship, and it's also related to higher levels of life satisfaction. Of course, we need more studies on this topic, but this points to us, for example, that this could be some of the means, some of the mechanisms by which religious and spiritual involvement impacts mental health or health as a whole. And this has been unfortunately an understudied subject, an understudied possible mechanism for the impact of spirituality and religion on health. However, this question of survival of afterlife has usually been considered a religious, metaphysical, or only a philosophical question. However, in the mid of 19th century, several authors, philosophers, and scientists struggled to transform this metaphysical question in an empirical question, in a scientific question. So it was transformed actually in a scientific investment, a scientific question in the 19th century. However, most people are unaware of the evidence produced by researchers by over 115 years. And actually, it's interesting to know that this sort of investigation, this discussion about the empirical evidence for some sort of survival after death, has involved some of the brightest and scientific and philosophical minds in the world, including several Nobel laureates like Charles Richer, Pierre-Marie Curie, Henri Bergson, and many others. So our talk from now on will focus exactly on this. Actually, we have just written a book on the topic that will be released in the end of this month. It will be published by Springer, the publisher Springer. We wrote it with a colleague, psychiatrist colleague, Mariana Costa, and a philosopher, Humberto Schubert Coelho. And we basically reviewed, presented, and discussed the best available empirical evidence for survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death. To start, we need to address some of the main arguments against survival of consciousness, survival of mind, of soul, and even to address is it possible to perform some sort of scientific or empirical investigation on the subject. Because of that, we need to start addressing some misguided philosophical and ideological prejudices that could cloud a fair, rational analysis of the body of empirical evidence. One of the major blocks to an open discussion about this is the idea that neuroscience proves that the brain generates mind. Usually, three sorts of evidence are presented to support this claim. The idea that the brain stimulation, drugs, brain lesions, or physiological dysfunctions affect mind. For example, Alzheimer's dementia or psychedelics. So if we alter the brain functioning, we will alter mind functioning. So some people extrapolate from this that it shows that brain produces mind. The second is the correlation between brain activation and mind activities. We have functional MRI, SPECT, and other functional neuroimaging studies showing some correlations between brain activity and mind activity. And finally, some parallels between the evolution or development of the brain and the mind. For example, throughout life, our human life, or throughout the evolution of species. The more complex the brain, the more complex the mind. So usually these are presented as definite proofs that brain generates mind. However, all this evidence have been known for more than 100 years. And it's interesting that the key founders of modern scientific psychology, like Bill Wundt and William James, and some of the key founders of neuroscience, like Sir Charles Sherrington and Wilbur Penfield, all of them were very well aware of this previous evidence. However, neither of them hold physicalist views of mind. They did not believe that the brain produces mind, that the mind is just a product of electrical and chemical brain activity. They believed, for example, that the brain can be an organ for limiting and determining to a certain form a consciousness elsewhere produced. So the brain could be not the producer of mind, but it could be a kind of filter, a tool for mind manifestation. And that is the point. All those evidence that we presented previously could be explained in both ways. We could understand these experiences if we believe that the brain is the producer of mind, but also the same findings would be found if we have the brain as a filter from mind manifestation. So this previous evidence, they are not enough to distinguish if the brain is the producer or an instrument, a tool for mind manifestation. And this is one point. The second point is that there is a huge gap, explanatory gap, like David Chalmers, philosopher of mind, claims, between what we know from the brain functioning and the experience, the first person experience of consciousness, of feeling love, of feeling hungry, of seeing the red of an apple, the qualia. So there is a huge explanatory gap on this. And even the people who hold some physicalist perspective of the mind-brain relationship, they cannot explain how brain would generate this first person perspective. But usually, in the words of Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, they use the promissory materialism. Usually it's said that in the future, we just need to wait a little bit, but in the future, we will be able to explain this. We don't know how, but some way we will show this. And this promissory materialism has been a strategy used at least for 300 years. And a very recent book by a very prominent German philosopher, Marcus Gabriel, I'm Not My Brain is the name of the book. He also make us aware about what he calls neuromythology, misuse of neuroscience to create a mythology about the understanding of mind. Of course, I will not have time to go in deep in any of these topics. I'm trying to synthesize a whole book in only 30 minutes, but I will just present some ideas. Of course, in the discussions, we could go deeper. Another major block for the understanding or the acceptance of the possibility of survival is the idea that science has proved physicalism. Physicalism is the idea the only thing that exists in the universe are physical forces and particles, and anything else of it would be superstition. This is one idea. And the second idea is that survival of consciousness or of the soul would imply some sort of supernaturalism. First, physicalism, the idea that everything that exists in the universe is composed by physical particles and forces, is not an empirical finding, is a metaphysical assumption. And so this is one point. It's not a consequence of the scientific study of nature. Actually, and it's also not a needed assumption for producing science. Actually, most of the founders of modern science were not physicalists. And also, survival does not imply denying or neglecting all the scientific achievements that we okay? The idea we could add another aspect of the universe, for example, without denying what we already know. So here is a summary of some myths of these misguided assumptions about the topic related to survival. Like as we said previously, neuroscience has proved that the brain generates mind, that all learned people reject survival. This is also false, has been proved false by many different studies. It's not a scientific fact. And so we don't have time to go further, but this is some just general ideas. Okay. If we remove these a priori assumptions that would block any possibility of discussion in a scientific perspective or rational perspective, the idea of survival, the next move would be, but would it be possible to have any sort of empirical evidence for survival of the soul, survival of mind, of consciousness? Is it possible to translate this millennial philosophical, religious quest in an empirical scientific quest? Several authors agree that yes, it's possible. The idea is that what characterizes us as persons. For example, Alan, Bruno, I've been in touch with them for several years, and all of them has a pattern of qualities. All times that I meet Alan and Bruno, I expect some continuity of character and memory. This is what characterizes Alan and Bruno. And that is another very important aspect. Just a thought experiment. Let's imagine, of course, I don't wish this at all, but let's imagine that my friend Bruno has a terrible accident and he has his body completely burned, but he survives. But he's completely disfigured. We cannot recognize him, but just looking at his body. And let's imagine that there is no DNA tests to assure that he is Bruno. If I meet Bruno, how could I know that disfigured body is actually Bruno? If this disfigured body would show the continuity of character and memory, if he remembers things from where we were together in the past, if his character is still prevalent, if his skills are still prevalent, if this disfigured body shows all these features, I will surely believe that I have in front of me my friend Bruno, despite not being able to recognize him through his body. So what actually matters is the continuity of character and memory. So, and what if Bruno dies? If Bruno died in this terrible accident? If I would search for some sort of evidence for his survival, I'm sorry, Bruno, for using you as an example, but I'm sure you forgive me. And I would expect the memory, the continuity of memory. If he would be able to remember facts, idea in large number, accurate and covering several topics. If he was able to identify people that he was acquainted when he was alive. Also, if he would be able to exhibit some skills for example, to be able to speak in English, for example, in a foreign language, like he is able to speak in addition to Portuguese, our mother tongue. Also, if he is able to exhibit some other skills, some artistic skills, or even if his handwriting would be similar. In addition, of course, the personality traits, temperament, the character, the personal style. Okay. And exactly on this, so if we can find this body of evidence, it would falsify the idea that Bruno disappeared, the personality of Bruno disappeared when he died. I would have some evidence that this mind, this soul, in some way or another, was still alive. And spiritual experience can be very helpful in this point, exactly because this spiritual experience are the major source of beliefs in this spiritual realm, in this transcendental realm, and even in the belief in afterlife. For example, people having near-death experiences, quite often they increase their belief in afterlife, for example, because they had some sort of experience that to them showed them that they are something beyond the body that could survive. Okay, so these experiences are very frequent throughout human history, and it can be an empirical base to test paradigms candidate to explain the mind and the mind-brain relationship. For example, is it possible to have an evidence of memory and consciousness when the brain is not working? Unfortunately, it has been until recently a neglected research area, but it has increased a lot very recently. In this topic of mind-brain relationship, the nature of spiritual experience, we are in what the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn says, in a pre-paradigmatic area. We don't have a scientific paradigm to make sense of the mind-brain relationship, of consciousness, and even of spiritual experience. We don't have a good paradigm that is well accepted by most of the scientists and could explain properly all these experiences. Because of that, it's important to have theoretical pluralism. It's important to have different proposals, different hypotheses, different paradigm candidates to make sense of these experiences. And now, moving specifically to the religious and spiritual experiences, or the nature of the spiritual experience, we already know a lot about the prevalence of these experiences, about the impact of this experience. The question is, okay, most of people have some sort of religious spiritual experience. These spiritual experiences are usually not pathological. They are not markers of psychopathology. On the opposite, they tend to be positive on mental health, in quality of life, and so on and so forth. But then the next question is, what are actually these spiritual experiences? What is the nature of these experiences? If we assume that physicalist perspective, that only physical particles and force exist, what we call reductionist materialism, we need to reduce these experiences to some sort of physical explanations. Usually, when people hold these ideas, or they ignore these experiences, because if the spiritual experience claims some sort of transcendental reality, if it's assumed a priori that there is no transcendental reality, everything is physical particles and forces, so they cannot have any ontological reality. And based on this, usually throughout 20th century, for a long time, these experiences were simply ignored. Serious people don't believe that. Serious people don't have such experience. It's just a vestige from the primitive ideas, or we could explain away these experiences. They are nothing but perceptual problems, like hallucinations. They are nothing but cognitive distortions, or caused by psychological needs, or they are nothing but social-cultural constructions. These are the most prevalent view when someone holds a reductionist materialist perspective. However, if To do science, we do not need to be tied to reductionist materialist perspectives. Of course, these explanations are important. They can explain much of these experiences. But the point is, can they explain all these experiences? We will argue that they can't. And
Yes.
the idea, basically, as I said, William James said that all these relevant spiritual experiences, they usually are with difficulty explained by the production theory, the theory that the brain produces mind. These experiences that have been reported in all times throughout human history, these are quite paradoxical and meaningless in the production, the physicalist theory. However, they fall very naturally in the other theory, the idea of continuity of consciousness. This is one of the ideas that William James proposed to us. Let me just skip because of the benefit of time. But actually, there are many studies that have been published about these spiritual experiences that can be related to the possibility of consciousness beyond the brain. This is a systematic review that we published a few years ago. We found almost 2,000 papers published in journals indexed at the Web of Science database. And so here are the sorts of spiritual experience that they are investigating. And these papers have impact factors similar to other more mainstream areas. So let's move for some practical examples of this experience. For example, near-death and out-of-body experiences. What's most interesting in near-death experiences is that many people who have near-death experiences, especially, for example, in cardiac arrest, we know that in cardiac arrest, the brain stops working few seconds later because the shortage of oxygen and glucose. The brain becomes electrically flat few seconds later. However, despite that, many survivors of near-death experience claim to have clear consciousness in this dysfunctional or non-functional brain. And their phenological experience is quite different from delirium that we can see often in ICU patients, for example. And when people recover from this experience, they say that these experiences are more real than reality. And even there are several studies analyze the quality of these memories. And these memories have even more features of real memories than even real memories from usual aspects of their lives. And this different also from hallucinatory experience in ICU delirium. These experiences are still held as deeply true, and also they have deep and lasting impact on values and beliefs, especially increase of spirituality, increase in belief in afterlife. In this experience, quite often they have out-of-body experience. They see themselves, they perceive themselves as out of their body and seeing their body from a different vantage point. And there are similar transcultural features. Of course, there are some variations in transcultural difference. However, the core of this experience are quite similar. They are not dependent, the core of this experience, of religious belief, educational level, fear of death, duration of cardiac arrest, and even the use of medication. They are also not related to intensity of hypoxia. And there are also dozens of verified veridical perceptions perceived during this near-death experience. This is one example of a case published at The Lancet about 20 years ago. That is basically a patient who had a cardiac arrest in the street, and the patient was brought to the hospital. So the patient received, when he arrived at the hospital, heard message defibrillation. They tried to intubate the patient, but he had dentures. So the nurse had to remove the dentures and put them in the trash can. Meanwhile, they continued the resuscitation procedures. About an hour and a half only, the patient resumed the heart rhythm and blood pressure. Of course, the patient was still comatose ventilated, and intubated. So he was transferred to the ICU to continue the artificial respiratory assistance. Only about 1 week again, the nurse met again the patient. The nurse who was in the team who assisted the patient in the resuscitation maneuver. The moment that the patient sees the patient, he says, "Oh, that nurse knows where my dentures are. Yes, you were there when I was brought into the hospital, and you took my dentures all out of my mouth and put them onto that car. It had all these bottles on it, and there was this sliding drawer underneath, and there you put my teeth." I was especially amazed because I remember this patient was at that time in deep coma. And actually, for the reports, the nurse said that he had fixed pupils with no brainstem reflex. So he was in deep coma in the process of CPR. When I asked further, it appeared that the man had seen himself lying in bed, that he had perceived from above how nurses and doctors had been busy with the CPR. He was also able to describe correctly and in detail the small room in which he had been resuscitated, as well as the appearance of those present like myself. At the time that he observed the situation, he had been very much afraid that we would stop the CPR, that he would die. And it's true that we had been very negative about the patient's prognosis due to his very poor medical condition when admitted. The patient tells me that he desperately and unsuccessfully tried to make it clear to us that he was still alive and that we should continue CPR. He's deeply impressed by his experience and says he is no longer afraid of death. 4 weeks later, he left the hospital as a healthy man. So this is one example. There are actually a recent handbook of near-death experience published about 100 of these reports showing a clear consciousness, verified perceptions that patients had that they were not supposed to have because the brain was not functional during that period. So this is some sort of suggestion that some sort of consciousness can exist when the brain is not working. And not only that, the importance of this experience also has impact throughout their lives. This study itself followed these patients up for until 8 years. It still had a strong impact on patients compared to patients who had cardiac arrest, who were resuscitated, but did not have near-death experience. So the near-death experience adds a lot the impact of this experience on the patients. Okay, so this is one sort of experience. The other sort of experience is what is called mediumship. Mediums claim to have the ability to perceive or to communicate with or to be under the control of deceased persons. These experiences actually are widespread throughout history also. Basically, all religious spiritual traditions has some sort of communication with spiritual entities, and many of them communication with deceased people. Okay, just to give an example, this is a famous, not recently, 20 years ago, deceased the Brazilian medium, Chico Xavier. He has just elementary education, 4 years of education, very modest financial resource, and worked throughout his life as a low-level public servant. He retired as a public servant. But despite that, and in parallel to this regular work, he had a long life of trance channeling. And this trance channeling in Brazil, in Spiritism, is always free of charge. He never earned any money or any gifts, whatever, based on this experience. He always lived a very humble life. But he wrote, despite having only 4 years of education, he wrote 450 books through trance mediumship. This book sold 60 million copies that has been translated to 18 different languages. All the copyrights have been donated to charitable works. In addition to these books, he also wrote thousands of letters attributed to deceased people. Okay, and we published 2 papers, 2 papers investigating in depth some of these letters. For example, this is a letter that was allegedly written by an engineer student who died drowned, okay, when he was 24 years old. Few months later, the family visited Chico Xavier, the medium, and they just told him that they lost their relative. They were devastated by it. They provide no other information against that. Okay. So, and these sessions were public, as we can see in this picture. For example, people from around all of the place were watching it. And in this first letter, for example, the letter contained a lot of precise information, not only how the circumstance by which the person died, but also even the names. The names, for example, of a deceased grandfather, for example, and even the name of a deceased aunt that was not knew by the sister who was attending the session. Okay, so all this, and even some features of personality, for example, the everyday kiss. He liked to kiss everyone. He was very well known in his city, among his family, by being a person who likes to kiss everyone, things like that. Oh, just remembering, he lived about 500 kilometers far from where the medium actually lived. So, so very specific information like events, feelings, thoughts, names, name of places, name of people, and dates. All of them were very consistent, and we were not able to find ways by which, normal ways by which the medium could have access to this information. A more recent paper we published, exactly similar kind of investigation, was published a few years ago in a similar set of letters related to another person. And there has been actually controlled, triple-blind controlled experiments with mediums. Recently, a meta-analysis was published with 18 controlled blind experiments by which the relatives need to rate, to score the mediumistic readings without knowing if the reading is intended to themselves or if they are control readings matched by gender and age, for example, to control for fraud, to control for over-endorsement because of the grief, and also to control for coincidence. So the finding of the meta-analysis was that the mediums produced reliable information above chance. Okay. And now, moving to the last sort of investigation, people who claim to remember previous lives. We just published also a review, a scoping review of the literature in this field. Based reincarnation is a widespread belief. Of course, we know that's most prevalent in the East, but also about 30% in the Western world also believe in reincarnation. Actually, many people are not aware of this, but 2,500 cases have been reported and documented in scientific environments, specifically the University of Virginia, the School of Medicine in United States. What usually happens is that children, as soon as they start to speak, about 2 years old, they start to claim that they had a previous life, and then they start to provide memories, claimed memories from a previous life. And in several cases, these memories have been shown to be accurate, and they have been registered before the people try to check this, and they are very accurate. In addition, even more interesting and challenging, some of these people, they have birthmarks and birth defects that are consistent with injuries suffered by the alleged previous personality, specifically when they were when they died. In addition, these children, quite often, they have emotional reactions and even PTSD symptoms coinciding with the mode of death of the alleged previous personality. Okay, and these findings have been replicated by different researchers in different cultures. Just to give an example, this is an actual case from Erlendur Haraldsson. Erlendur Haraldsson is a professor of psychology at the University of Iceland. Unfortunately, he passed away, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, and he allowed us to use his slides of this case. This is his own slides. Okay, so it's a case that he investigated in Sri Lanka. So it was about Purnima. When Purnima was 3 years old, he started to speak of a previous life. Okay, and she said that she lived in the other side of the river from the Kelenia temple in the area called Angoda. They did not live there, okay, but she saw in the TV the Kelenia temple, and then she said, "Oh, I lived there. Behind this temple, there is a river, and I lived beyond this river. I made incense sticks of the brand Ambiga and Gita Picha. I was selling incense sticks on a bicycle, and then I had an accident with a big vehicle, and then I'm here." Okay, so the father of Purnima was a director, a principal of a school, and one of his teachers, he was from this area, and then he went there to start to investigate the case. Actually, that is the Kelenia temple that she saw on TV, and actually they found an incense maker, this guy, who actually had a brother who died in a bicycle hit by a truck when he was selling incenses in the Kelenia temple. And these incense were exactly of the brands Ambiga and Gita Picha, the brands that were not available where Purnima lived. Okay. In addition, when she was brought there to meet these people, when she looked at this incense box, she said, "Oh, you changed the box because it's not the same that we used at that time. We made a different box, and it's correct." So they had changed it's not the same. And also she described how they prepared the sticks, incense sticks. In addition, she had birthmarks. Okay, these hypopigmented marks here in the hypochondrium, and they are in the same area of the. This is the analysis of the body of the deceased incense maker, and the post-mortem report says exactly they had fractures in the ribs in this area that perforated the liver, spleen, and lungs, an area similar to the place where she had these birthmarks. Okay, so this is just an example. So here are the 20 different statements that Purnima made allegedly about her previous lives. And from these 20, 14 were correct, 3 incorrect, and 3 undetermined. As we can see here, these are very precise information that it's very hard to be just by chance or by imagination. And the family and the children, Purnima, they had never been in Kelenia. They had not previous contact with that people. Okay, this is just one case to illustrate the importance of this. So moving to the end. So these are 3 examples of empirical evidence based on spiritual experience, near-death experience, with out-of-body experience, mediumistic experience, reincarnation cases. Okay, and the major explanations could be fraud, it could be chance, it could be fabrications of the unconscious mind, or even it could be some sort of extrasensorial perception, telepathy, clairvoyance, and so on and so forth. However, the good cases, of course, I don't have time here to go in depth, but all of these cases had been very rigorously investigated, excluding chance, fraud, and the precise of the information. It's important. It's interesting to see the convergence of the evidence. Different researchers from broad variety of research groups, countries, and methods, from a wide range of phenomena. I just showed 3 kinds of phenomena. There are many others. All these phenomena reinforce each other, point to the same conclusion: survival of consciousness. For each piece individually, we could have an unlikely explanation of fraud, chance, cryptomnesia, or extrasensorial perception. However, we need to multiply dozens of times the concessions to these unlikely possibilities to best explain the best cases. So there is a convergence of different hypotheses, different evidence to the survival hypothesis. The idea of survival of consciousness has several virtues desirable in a good scientific hypothesis. For example, they have empirical adequacy. The empirical consequences are true. It's a broadness of scope explains a wide range of phenomena and predicts new kinds of phenomena, like PTSD symptoms in these children who report traumatic death in previous life. And it's also the simplicity to explain all this. Actually, most authors, scientists, philosophers who have took the time to publish reviews of the whole body of these sorts of evidence, they conclude by the survival hypothesis. And the conclusion here is that the convergence of the diversified and robust body of evidence of the persistence after death of the memory and character that makes up our personal identity. A wide variety of human experience, like apparitions, mediumship, near-death experience, case suggestive of reincarnation, they mutually reinforce each other, point to the same conclusion: survival of consciousness. These beliefs and this experience has been always highly prevalent in all cultures and ages. It has been replicated under strictly controlled studies by many of the most competent researchers in the last 115 years. To reject survivalist explanations for these findings would require postulating simultaneously a sequence of very unlikely assumptions and facts. So survival of consciousness of the soul is the most simple, comprehensive, and natural explanation for the empirical data discussed here in this talk. So one conclusion could be that survival of human consciousness after permanent body death may be a fact of nature. So, as I said, I'm sorry because I had to go in a hurry, but much more is in this book. I would like to go deeper and investigate it more. And here are my contacts. Thank you very much.